7 people should be fine. The child can sit separately. My mother-in-law Jane's words rang out clearly and without hesitation. Her constant torment had reached its peak, but today was the day I planned to confront it all. At this family gathering, I intended to reveal a hidden truth that had been simmering beneath the surface. I'm Nancy, a 28-year-old chef. After graduating from culinary school, I began working at a renowned Western-style restaurant where I met my husband, Mike. He was a regular customer at the restaurant, hailing from a family with a long-standing legacy in the electronics industry. Following his father's passing last year, Mike took over the family business. My own family is fairly ordinary, except for one notable detail. My parents and even my older brother are all chefs. Growing up, every meal at home was a special event, fueling my passion for cooking. I'm proud to say I graduated at the top of my class thanks to my family's support and background. Generally, I'm a calm person, but I take great pride in my culinary skills. However, everything changed after marriage. When Mike and I decided to marry, I knew I would be moving into this family home. While I was prepared for the transition, I didn't anticipate it happening so quickly. In retrospect, I wish we had discussed it more thoroughly. Initially, Jane welcomed me with unexpected warmth. She was incredibly attentive, bringing treats and offering to handle household chores. Naturally, her home-cooked meals became a staple at our dining table. But there was a catch. Her cooking was vastly different from what I was used to. Jane, coming from the northern part of the country, preferred much stronger flavors. Her seasoning was so intense that it was hard to distinguish the ingredients in her dishes. A bite often felt like wading through a sea of salt. Jane would cheerfully say, "You need it this strong to make the rice more appetizing," and would encourage me to have seconds. Internally, I found it overwhelming, though Mike, sitting next to me, seemed to think the food was just a bit bland. I was stunned when Jane mentioned that she had toned down the flavors for my benefit. Each day, my sense of taste seemed to dull, which affected my confidence in seasoning dishes at work. Thankfully, the head chef, who always inspects my dishes, hadn't raised any concerns, but I felt compelled to act. I began waking up earlier to prepare breakfast to my taste, which helped restore some of my confidence in seasoning. However, Jane noticed my efforts and started growing distant. Her behavior changed subtly at first, ignoring my greetings more frequently and making sharp comments about my cooking. "Isn't the dinner tonight a bit bland?" she asked. I reassured her. I believe I seasoned it properly. Despite my attempts to adapt, it seemed Jane's disapproval was only growing. I took a bite and knew instantly that it wasn't bland. The seasoning felt lacking, almost tasteless. "Doesn't it bother you?" Jane asked, her voice laced with disapproval. "I think for health reasons, it's better not to make it too rich. Enjoying delicious food is important, but preparing meals at home isn't your job. You should adjust to our preferences." No matter what I said, Jane always had a counter-argument. Then, with a dismissive gesture, she drenched the dish I had put so much effort into with soy sauce. I was confused and hurt. I was trying to be considerate of the family's health with lighter seasoning, yet this was the result. I felt lost, and my mind drifted back to an earlier event, my niece Jessica's 5th birthday party, held at my sister-in-law Kathy's home. Kathy has 2 older sisters who are incredibly warm and supportive. From the start, they assured me they'd be there for me if I ever needed anything. Their husbands were equally kind and approachable. At the party, I helped with the cooking as Jane had asked. The table was filled with a variety of dishes clearly distinguished by their origins. My dishes were Western style, while Jane's were traditional Japanese, leading to a stark contrast in ambience and seasoning. The party began on a high note. Jessica, who adores the omurice from NY's restaurant, was thrilled to have it at home. Kathy, with a cheerful smile, said, "I often make that omurice myself." Jessica, brimming with enthusiasm, declared, "I love omurice. NY's is the best." Her excitement brightened the mood instantly. However, Jane seemed slightly out of place. She pushed her own dish, saying, "Come on, try this. It's Grandma's special stew." Jessica hesitated, noting, "It's a bit too salty for me." After tasting the stew, Kathy's husband grimaced and asked, "Could you tone down the salt next time? Can I have some more water, please?" The atmosphere grew awkward as Kathy's comment hung in the air. "Mom, don't you think your dish is a bit too rich today? Maybe you could cook with Nancy and pick up some seasoning tips from her," Kathy said with a laugh. Though she might have been joking, Jane's face flushed with anger. Without a word, she snapped and retreated from the room. I felt overwhelmed and speechless. Despite my best efforts to help with the cooking, it seemed like I had inadvertently made things worse. The tension lingered, and eventually, everyone decided to leave early. It was disheartening to have my heartfelt efforts criticized. That night, I apologized to Jane, but her response was sharp. "You're just living here, and yet you're so presumptuous." I was hurt, but I tried to understand her feelings and be patient. However, the next day, it became clear that her attitude towards me had shifted. She began adding excessive seasoning to the breakfast I prepared, often grimacing as she did. Sometimes, she would throw the food away without even tasting it. When I sought support from Mike, he dismissed my concerns with comments like, "Aren't you being a bit stubborn?" or "You're probably just overreacting." His responses made me feel distant, as if the issue was not his concern. Despite being newlyweds, he started coming home late and avoided family events. The growing distance between us made me question if I could continue living like this. I'd even considered divorce, but the thought of explaining the situation to our parents and relatives was daunting. Things took a turn for the worse when Jane fell down the stairs and injured her foot. Kathy promptly offered to help with daily chores, but Jane insisted that I take over. She began assigning me a multitude of errands and even called me during work hours. The constant early departures from work led to concerned glances and complaints from my colleagues, ultimately forcing me to resign. When Jane learned of my resignation, she remarked with a sense of superiority, "It's a pity, considering how much you love that job." The days that followed were incredibly tough. I was on call for Jane day and night, leaving me with little time for myself. Even when I asked Mike for help, he consistently made implausible excuses, claiming he was too busy or staying overnight at the company. I felt I could no longer stay in this house, but I didn't want to leave without making a statement. One clear morning, as the three of us sat at the table, I mustered the courage to say, "I'm considering a divorce." Mike and Jane were stunned. "Why all of a sudden?" Mike asked, wide-eyed. "We've just gotten married. Did I do something wrong? Aren't you misunderstanding something?" Jane, with a disgruntled expression, added, "Asking for a divorce without any reason is childish." Their reactions made me feel belittled, but my resolve was unshakable. "I'm not misunderstanding anything," I replied firmly. "Mike is constantly away, and Jane seems to take pleasure in tormenting me. Why would I want to stay in such an environment? I'm going to get a divorce. My decision is final." My declaration took them by surprise. "I'm sorry, I'll come home earlier from now on," Mike said, his face showing some displeasure. "If you want, you can go back to your parents' home for a while. But considering my mother's leg, could you stay here a bit longer?" Mike's suggestion carried an undertone of frustration. I acknowledged his offer but replied simply, "Understood." At that moment, I noticed the smirks on their faces, like mother, like son. For a short period, Jane's antagonistic behavior diminished and Mike genuinely tried to come home earlier. However, this brief period of peace didn't last long. Mike's overtime work increased and Jane's ill temper resurfaced. Despite her supposedly injured foot, she frequently ventured out. As I pondered their behavior, I was on the verge of uncovering an unbelievable truth. A few days later, my cell phone rang continuously with calls from Jane and Mike. Mike's voice was filled with anger. "Where are you? How could you just leave my mother alone like that? You were the one who said I could go back to my parents' home," I coldly retorted, "but my mother's foot still isn't healed." Mike continued with seemingly trivial excuses, and in the background, I could hear Jane's irritated voice. "From now on, let's discuss matters through a lawyer," I said with a heavy sigh before hanging up. Back at my parents' house, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension as I began to prepare for the next steps. I spent my days feeling rejuvenated at my parents' home. The warmth and familiarity there helped heal my emotional wounds. The time I spent with them felt truly fulfilling, especially when my mother prepared my favorite dishes. Her love was palpable, and as I helped with the cooking, I felt the deep bond of family once more. When my mother praised the dish I made, saying it was delicious, tears welled up in my eyes. In the midst of this comforting routine, my phone rang unexpectedly. To my surprise, it was Jane. She apologized for everything she had done in the past and invited me to her birthday party, which was to be held at a renowned upscale restaurant in town. Despite my mixed feelings, I saw it as a chance to bridge gaps and decided to attend. Jane seemed satisfied as she informed me of the party details, including the time, On the day of the event, Mike and Jane were already waiting outside the restaurant. When they spotted me, both greeted me with smug smiles. The attendees were the same as the previous party. My two sisters-in-law, Kathy and Meg, their husbands, my niece Jessica, Mike and Jane, 8 people in total. Before everyone arrived, Mike and Jane instructed me not to mention our divorce to the family until after dinner. When Kathy, Meg, and their families showed up, Kathy greeted me warmly. "Nancy, it's been a while. You seem to have lost a bit of weight. Are you doing okay?" Once everyone was gathered, we approached the restaurant. A staff member greeted us and said, "Your reservation is for 7 people under the name of Jane, correct?" I was sure we had 8, but Jane interjected, "Yes, 7 is correct. Nancy can sit at a different table." As I looked around, I saw the surprised expressions on the faces of my sisters-in-law and their husbands, while Mike and Jane wore satisfied smirks. It became clear to me that this was their plan. How childish could they be? "Nancy, you've prepared a special surprise, haven't you?" Jane taunted with a smirk. Who makes themselves the center of attention with a surprise at their own birthday party? Only someone like Jane, I thought. Well, if that's how she wants it. I quickly came up with a delightful surprise. "Nancy, do you really have something planned?" "Even if you don't feel too much pressure," Kathy said with concern. I whispered back, "Yes, I do have something in mind, but Jane's behavior is making it difficult." Excusing myself, I asked the staff if any seats were available. They kindly offered me a spot that was out of Jane and Mike's line of sight. As the group enjoyed their meal, a special children's menu was served for Jessica, who excitedly declared, "This tastes just like the owner from Ometers." Kathy praised the dishes and Jane boasted, "Ever since this restaurant got a new chef, the flavors have improved significantly. The meat dish coming out next is supposed to be outstanding." Mike nodded in agreement, and soon the much-anticipated meat dish began to be served to Kathy, Meg, and their families. For some reason, Jane and Mike's table was overlooked. Jane, clearly agitated, called out to a waiter with a raised voice, "Please wait a moment, we will serve it shortly." The waiter replied, "I watched with some amusement before heading to the kitchen to prepare." A few minutes later, I emerged wearing a chef's apron and announced, "Sorry for the wait." Jane and Mike stared at me in disbelief. "Could it be that you made the dish?" Kathy asked, her voice filled with surprise and delight. Jane and Mike were left speechless as I cheerfully placed the dishes in front of them. I even gave them a playful wink and said, "Enjoy." Feeling mischievous, I presented Jane with a special dish drenched in soy sauce and gleaming darkly on the plate. For the final touch, I poured even more soy sauce over it, leaving Jane stunned into silence. I then set a unique dish in front of Mike, saying, "I hope this energizes you like a battery." I placed several actual batteries on Mike's plate with a smirk. My niece burst into laughter at the sight, while Kathy, Meg, and their husbands looked on with a mix of shock and concern. "What kind of service is this? Where's the manager?" Mike demanded. "You won't get away with this." Just then, the restaurant's manager approached, maintaining a calm demeanor. "Is there an issue here?" he asked. "You think you can just do this to us without consequences?" Mike challenged. The manager replied, "Given the disruption to our business, we are considering pressing charges against you." Jane and Mike were left speechless by the turn of events. It turned out Jane and Mike had been frequent visitors, often causing trouble. They had a reputation for complaining about the food and disturbing other patrons. Although their behavior had been overlooked before because they were related to me, the manager made it clear that this would no longer be tolerated. "Since they're related to my family, we've been lenient, but we won't hesitate to take action now," the manager said, addressing me. "Is that all right with you, Nancy?" "Of course," I replied. Jane and Mike stared in astonishment. It turned out my brother Jason had recently become the owner of the restaurant. He had been in France and couldn't attend my wedding, so while Jane and Mike knew about him, they had never met him. Jason, however, recognized them from the photos I had sent of my husband's family. "I'm sorry," Jason said, addressing Jane and Mike with a firm but polite tone. "I wasn't able to celebrate with you at the wedding," I began. "I wanted to approach you several times, but you always seemed to be with someone else." Jane and Mike looked at me with sheer disbelief. Sensing that this conversation might take a while, Kathy and Meg suggested to their husbands that they head home first. After seeing them off, they turned back to us. their smiles masking serious expressions. "Can we hear the details?" Kathy asked, her gaze intense. I was taken aback by Kathy and Meg's seriousness, a side of them I hadn't seen before. Mike attempted to explain. "Well, it was a meeting with colleagues from the industry. This restaurant is quite popular, so we decided to try it out." Just then, a staff member approached Mike, handing him a pair of earrings. "You left these behind during your last visit," the staff member said. Kathy raised an eyebrow and teased, "Were you dining with men who wear these?" I chuckled and replied, "It's not like that, Kathy. Mike has been having an affair with a woman who works at a nearby flower shop." Mike's face turned pale. "How did you find out?" he asked, shocked. "I hired a detective some time ago," I explained. "My suspicions were confirmed. They frequently met at this restaurant, which was their favorite spot. I even have photographic evidence of their meetings." Mike, no longer trying to hide his affair, said, "I truly love her. Marrying you was a mistake. I'm ready for a divorce." His response was a relief to me, as I had been considering divorce myself. "Fine, but make sure to pay the alimony," I replied. "No problem," Mike said confidently. "I recently landed a big business deal, so money isn't a concern." "That's good to hear," I said. Turning to Jane, who had remained quiet until now, I added, "And as for you, Jane, until recently you had been seeing someone for about 5 years, but your husband only passed away a year ago, right?" Jane's agitation was clear. Kathy and Meg, visibly injured, glared at their mother. They had been closer to their father and were likely upset by this revelation. What surprised me was that the detective knew so much about Jane because my father-in-law had hired him as well. I couldn't help but chuckle at the coincidence. "Did you really deceive our father for so long? And Mike, how could you betray such a lovely woman like Nancy?" Kathy and Meg exclaimed, their eyes filled with a mix of sadness, surprise, and anger. The growing awareness of other customers around us made it clear that continuing this conversation was becoming difficult. We proposed reconvening on another date and more private setting as I left the restaurant. I shared smiles with Jason and the other staff members, savoring a moment of joy and accomplishment. My brother later told me that many regular patrons were at the restaurant that day, and after the troublesome guests were evicted, the staff received applause from the other diners. Jason had only booked a table for 7 in advance, making our plan a flawless success. As a result, Mike and Jane would no longer be welcome at my brother's restaurant. A few days later, we held a private family meeting where, in front of Kathy and Meg, Mike and I signed our divorce papers. Mike coldly declared, "I don't care what happens from here on out." Jane lamented, "I can't believe such a troublesome Nancy was my son's wife, especially when I'm supposedly unable to walk." To cut off her endless complaints, I snapped, "Jane, watch your feet." To my surprise, Jane, who had claimed difficulty walking, leaped up, revealing that her leg had fully recovered. Her so-called pain was a mere act of retaliation against me. Her frequent outings despite her alleged pain had raised my suspicions, and it was clear she was deceitful to the end. But now she was someone I had no time for. Thus my short-lived marriage ended without regrets. The alimony was deposited into my account as promised. Whether Mike had to pay his mistress or not was irrelevant to me. In the aftermath, despite the hefty alimony that plunged him into debt, Mike reportedly broke up with his mistress shortly after our divorce. Kathy later told me that the woman was notorious in the local community for causing trouble with married men. Moreover, the significant business deal Mike had boasted about also fell through. His reputation suffered greatly after the commotion at Jason's restaurant, and word of the incident spread to his business associates. Given the importance of trust in their industry, the impending contract was soon rescinded. It was all a consequence of his own actions, and his professional future looked bleak. As for Jane, she was also abandoned by her male companion. After seeking medical attention for health concerns, she discovered that her excessive salt intake was the cause of her problems, and maintaining good health would now be a challenge for her. Her dietary habits over the years have led to this unfortunate outcome. I returned to work at the Western-style restaurant I had previously resigned from. Despite the trouble I had caused, my former colleagues welcomed me back warmly. Kathy, Meg, and my niece Jessica occasionally came to dine, cheering me on. They had completely cut ties with Mike and Jane, unable to forgive their actions, especially given their respect for my late father-in-law and their desire to protect me. Despite the ups and downs, I have reclaimed some of the most enjoyable and valuable moments of my life as a chef. I'm now leading a truly fulfilling life.